Picture this. I'm standing ankle-deep in stinking black mud where a crystal-clear 47-acre lake existed just 72 hours ago. The metallic clang of my sledgehammer echoes across what looks like an alien landscape-cracked earth stretching to the horizon. Scattered like dying whales across this apocalyptic wasteland are 24 million-dollar boats, their pristine white hulls now brown with decades of lake-bottom sludge. The stench hits you in waves, rotting fish, diesel fuel, and something that smells suspiciously like raw sewage. 300 yards away, Brenda Kelsworth, the HOA queen who started this war, is screaming into her phone while hosing down bone-dry swimming pools. Her luxury resort guests are loading suitcases, demanding refunds as bass and bluegill gasp in muddy puddles. 3 months ago, Brenda demolished the bridge my grandfather built in 1952, called it an eyesore. Well, Brenda, how's your $2 million eyesore looking now? But before I explain how I legally drained an entire lake, what would you do if someone bulldozed your family legacy while you were burying your father? Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Let's see how far this revenge story travels. My name is Marcus Henley, and 3 months ago I was just a divorced mechanical engineer trying to rebuild my life. At 47, I'd lost my marriage, was fighting for weekend custody, and the only place that didn't feel like a crime scene was my grandfather's cabin on Lake Willow. Ezra Henley bought 40 acres of what locals called Frog Pond back in 1951 for $800, his entire discharge bonus from Korea. Smart money said he was crazy. The lake was barely 12 acres then, more swamp than swimming hole. But Ezra had the kind of vision that comes from surviving frozen trenches and communist bullets. He hand-built everything with surplus Navy timber and sheer stubbornness. The cabin first, then the dock, and finally his masterpiece, a 70-foot bridge connecting our property to the main hiking trail. Each beam hand-selected, fitted with the precision of a man who'd learned that sloppy work gets people killed. No permits needed in 1952. Hell, the county office was one guy named Earl who worked out of his kitchen. The bridge became legend. Kids jumped off it every summer. 3 generations of marriage proposals happened on those weathered planks. By 2019, the Historical Society was pushing for state registry protection. The cabin still smelled like cedar shavings and Maxwell House, exactly like childhood visits when Grandpa would teach me to tie fishing knots by lamplight. Every weekend, I'd escape my echoing apartment for 2 hours of mountain roads and blessed silence. Then Hurricane Brenda made landfall. Brenda Kelsworth blew into our quiet backwater 5 years ago like something escaped from a Phoenix country club. Designer everything. From her bleached teeth to her imported Range Rover, she claimed real estate money, though nobody ever saw proof beyond her American Express black card. Within 6 months, she'd devoured the old Henderson Ranch across the lake and announced Willow Shores Estates luxury homes starting at $800,000, in a county where teachers made $35,000. The HOA formed faster than mold in a wet basement. Brenda crowned herself president before the first foundation was poured. Her jewel was Lake Vista Resort and Marina, $2 million of glass, steel, and enough Italian marble to repave Rome. Brenda's hobby was weaponizing municipal codes against anyone whose existence offended her aesthetic sensibilities. The Kowalski family's chicken coop? Agricultural nuisance in residential zone. Old Pete's fishing shack? Unpermitted structure posing safety hazard. Each violation came with fines that somehow funded more HOA improvements. My grandfather's bridge? That was blocking premium sightlines from her resort cabins. Can't have paying guests seeing actual history when they're dropping $300 a night for rustic lake experience. The ambush came October 15th, while I was burying my father 300 miles away. Cancer had eaten him alive in 6 weeks, diagnosis to funeral, like some cruel magic trick. I'd been sleeping in hospital chairs, then drowning in paperwork, completely hollowed out by grief. Sunday evening, I drove back desperate for the lake's silence. Instead, yellow tape fluttered where 70 years of family pride used to stand. The air reeked of diesel exhaust and betrayal. Wood chips scattered like bone fragments across ground that crunched underfoot like broken dreams. Stapled to my door. Unpermitted structure removed per Municipal Code 847B. Cleanup fees, $2,847. Have a blessed day. Willow Shores HOA. Security footage revealed the truth. 7 a.m. sharp, there's Brenda directing the excavator like some suburban Mussolini, pointing exactly where to cut. She'd worn her red heels, the ones reserved for town council meetings and property assassinations. Tuesday night, I crashed their HOA meeting. 23 people suffocating in a room built for 15, the air thick with hairspray and righteous indignation. "Mr. Henley," Brenda said without looking up from her leather portfolio, "your rustic aesthetic simply doesn't align with community standards. That bridge was an eyesore devaluing neighboring investments. That bridge was built by a Korean War veteran." "Without permits," she smiled, cold as lake ice in January. "Frankly, it blocked our guests' view of natural landscape." Vote 7-2. I owed cleanup fees. Driving home, my headlights caught fresh survey stakes along my shoreline, all marked with Brenda's company logo. Those survey stakes haunted my sleep for exactly 3 days. Then Brenda unleashed her legal pit bull. Wednesday's certified letter made my morning coffee taste like liquid hate. Cease and desist from Kelsworth and Associates Legal, which turned out to be Brenda's son-in-law Dale, fresh from some diploma mill and desperate to justify his existence. The accusations read like bad fan fiction: criminal trespassing, harassment of board members, and my personal favorite, verbal assault and intimidation for daring to speak at a public meeting. But paragraph 4 was the real gut punch. My boat launch violated setback requirements and would be demolished within 30 days. My boat launch, the concrete ramp Grandpa Ezra poured in 1953, before Dale was even a disappointed gleam in his father's eye. Thursday brought a lien notice that made my hands shake. $2,800 in unpaid HOA fines against property I'd owned longer than Brenda had lived in this state. The smell of legal paper and desperation filled my kitchen as I read the same threat 3 times, hoping the words would change. That afternoon, I drove to Ruby Martinez's law office, a converted Victorian that creaked like old bones with every step. Ruby was the kind of small-town lawyer who answered her own phone and didn't charge you for thinking. "Water rights," she said, spreading Grandpa's deed across her desk. The yellowed papers crackled like autumn leaves as she traced property lines with her finger. "Most people don't realize what they own." The story unfolded like a thriller I'd never heard. In 1951, Lake Willow was 12 acres of muddy fishing hole. But 2 years later, federal flood control money transformed it into 47 acres of tourist paradise. The county built a concrete dam on Ezra's land, installed spillways, created what brochures now called pristine mountain recreation. Here's what made my engineer brain light up. Ezra had granted an easement for the dam, but retained ownership rights. Ruby pulled out a law book that could stop a bullet and explain something called riparian doctrine, a fancy term meaning lakefront property owners get special privileges that can override pretty much everything newer. "Your grandfather was smarter than anyone realized," Ruby said, adjusting her reading glasses. "He didn't just buy land. He bought control." I was still processing this revelation when Brenda decided to escalate from legal threats to actual vandalism. Friday morning, I discovered my boat dock sabotaged support posts sawed through with surgical precision. My aluminum fishing boat sat tilted like a drunk sailor, taking on water through stress cracks. The metallic taste of rage filled my mouth as I examined the clean cuts, professional work done under cover of darkness. My security camera told the story, lens spray-painted black around midnight. Brenda's documented alibi. Wine and cheese fundraiser for her lake beautification committee until 11:30. Perfect timing, perfect cover. But even small-town criminals make mistakes. Saturday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Jake Morrison, 22 and drowning in community college debt, knocked on my door looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The kid worked marina maintenance for Brenda, needed the job for his pregnant girlfriend, but apparently still had a functioning conscience. "Mr. Henley," he whispered, glancing around like Brenda might emerge from the pine trees. "I didn't touch your dock, but I saw Dale's truck by your place around 2 a.m. Friday. Heard power tools running." Jake showed me a text that made everything click. "Discrete dock repair needed ASAP, $500 bonus for weekend completion, no questions asked." Classic Brenda. Create the problem, then profit from the solution. The woman had turned extortion into an art form. While I documented saw marks and photographed damage, Ruby dove deeper into state archives. What she discovered was pure gold. The 1954 environmental study required for federal dam funding included emergency drainage rights for the property owner. Translation: if Ezra's heir, that would be me, determined the dam needed inspection or maintenance, I could legally drain the entire lake. The county engineer had to sign off, but couldn't override my safety concerns. Ruby explained it over coffee that tasted like victory. Marcus, your grandfather built himself a nuclear option. Someone threatens the lake's integrity, you pull the plug. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. Brenda destroyed my bridge to improve her resort's view, but that view depended entirely on water I controlled. Sunday evening, I stood on my damaged dock watching Brenda's sunset cruise return to her marina. 12 guests sipping champagne, their laughter echoing across water that existed at my complete discretion. The gentle lap of waves against tilted support posts sounded almost musical. Jake's phone buzzed with Monday's assignment. Prepare guest boats for morning fishing excursions. Weather looks perfect. I smiled for the first time in weeks, remembering something Ruby had mentioned about old water law cases she'd studied back in law school. Turns out, when it comes to riparian rights, the original property deed usually beats everything that comes after: HOA covenants, municipal codes, even federal regulations if your ownership predates them. The weather was indeed about to change. Dramatically. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes you believe in fresh starts. That optimism lasted exactly until I checked my dock. Someone had finished the job overnight. My aluminum boat now sat completely submerged, only the tip of the bow visible above water like a metallic tombstone. The remaining dock posts had been cut through, leaving jagged wooden teeth protruding from the lake bottom, but this time our vandal had gotten sloppy. Fresh tire tracks led from the access road to my shoreline-wide, expensive treads that looked suspiciously like the ones on Dale's oversized pickup. More telling were the cigarette butts scattered near the water's edge. Marlboro Reds, same brand I'd seen Dale chain-smoking outside the HOA meetings. The security camera remained blind, lens still coated in black paint thick as gilt. But criminals, even suburban ones, always leave breadcrumbs. I was photographing tire impressions when Jake appeared through the morning mist like some nervous ghost. Kid looked like he'd been awake all night, probably wrestling with his conscience and losing. "Mr. Henley," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "I can't do this anymore. Last night around 3 a.m., I saw Dale's truck leaving your place. When I came to work this morning, Ms. Kelsworth offered me a $500 bonus for discreet marina maintenance." Jake's phone buzzed. Text from Brenda. "Dock repairs completed successfully. Excellent work. Bonus deposited." The woman had just confessed to conspiracy via digital evidence. I almost felt sorry for how stupid criminals had become. That afternoon, while Ruby filed police reports about the vandalism, I started my own investigation into Lake Willow's history. The county courthouse basement smelled like old paper and forgotten secrets, exactly the kind of place where truth hides from sunlight. What I found in the 1954 environmental files changed everything. The original dam construction required federal approval because it used Army Corps of Engineers flood control funds. But buried in subsection 12 of the environmental impact study was language that made my engineer heart sing. The project mandated permanent public access to justify taxpayer investment. More importantly, the easement agreement included specific provisions for emergency drainage procedures. If the dam owner suspected structural integrity issues, complete drainage was authorized for inspection and maintenance. The county engineer had to review the decision, but federal law prevented them from overriding legitimate safety concerns. I remembered Ruby mentioning something about water law during our first meeting, how she'd specialized in it after witnessing too many developers bully small property owners. She'd explained that original riparian rights often trump everything newer: zoning laws, HOA covenants, even municipal ordinances. The legal principle was simple: first in time, first in right. Tuesday brought Brenda's most desperate move yet. She showed up at my door wearing her best concerned citizen costume, pearls, pressed slacks, and a smile that could freeze hell. Behind her stood 2 resort guests who looked like they'd stepped out of a country club catalog, all teeth and entitlement. "Marcus," she said, voice dripping with false sweetness, "we need to discuss your recent behavior. My guests are feeling unsafe with all this hostility." The hostility was me existing on my own property. "I'm prepared to make a generous offer," she continued, producing an envelope thick as a phone book. 400,000 cash for your entire property. That's 40% above market value. I opened the envelope. Cashier's check, legitimate bank, enough money to start over somewhere else. The smell of fresh ink and desperation wafted up like incense at a crooked altar. That's very generous, Brenda, but this property isn't for sale. Her mask slipped just enough to show the predator underneath. Marcus, you're fighting a war you can't win. I have resources, connections, legal firepower. You have what, a broken down cabin and hurt feelings? I have something better, I said, thinking about those federal documents cooling my kitchen table. I have time. After they left, I called Ruby with news about the federal compliance requirements. Her excitement was palpable through the phone. Marcus, this is bigger than vandalism or HOA disputes. If Brenda's resort violates federal access requirements, she owes repayment of the original flood control funding with 70 years of interest. That evening, I stood where my grandfather's bridge used to span the water, watching Brenda's evening wine cruise return to the marina. 15 guests this time, their laughter echoing across water that suddenly felt different. Not like something I lived beside, but something I controlled. The lake's surface reflected the setting sun like molten copper, beautiful and deceptive, just like Brenda's operation, gorgeous on the surface, rotten underneath. I pulled out my phone and called Pat Kowalski, the county engineer, if I was going to exercise emergency drainage rights. I needed official documentation that couldn't be challenged later. Pat, it's Marcus Henley. I think we need to discuss the structural integrity of Lake Willow Dam. When can you come out for an inspection? The weather was about to get very interesting. Wednesday morning brought Pat Kowalski and his clipboard to my doorstep. County engineers are a special breed, methodical, thorough, and incapable of bullshit. Pat had been inspecting dams since Carter was president, and his weathered hands told stories of concrete and water that most people would never understand. Marcus, he said, adjusting his hard hat against the morning sun, Ruby mentioned you have concerns about structural integrity. Let's take a look. We walked the dam's length together, Pat taking measurements while I provided historical documentation. The concrete looked solid from above, but 70 years of water pressure and freeze-thaw cycles had taken their toll. Hairline cracks spiderwebbed through the spillway walls like wrinkles on an old face. Siltation's the real problem, Pat said, pointing to discolored water near the marina. All that boat traffic stirs up bottom sediment faster than the lake can process it naturally. His soil samples told a story that made my blood boil. Heavy metals from fuel runoff, chemical residue from hull cleaners, and enough petroleum byproducts to classify sections of the lakebed as hazardous waste. The resort's high-speed boats and jet skis had turned 47 acres of mountain water into a toxic soup. Federal guidelines recommend periodic drainage for artificial lakes, Pat continued, making notes that would change everything. Removes accumulated pollutants, allows natural sediment cycling, should have been done 15 years ago. That afternoon, while Pat compiled his official report, Brenda launched her most vicious attack yet. The flyers appeared everywhere, telephone poles, store windows, car windshields like some suburban plague. My divorce photo stared back from every surface alongside selective quotes from court documents that made me sound like an unhinged stalker. Dangerous local threatens lake community, screamed the headline in 72-point font. Below it, carefully edited excerpts from my custody battle painted me as an unstable father with anger management issues and substance abuse history. The substance abuse? I'd admitted to drinking too much during my divorce proceedings. The anger management? Standard requirement after any contested custody case. Context stripped away, truth twisted into weaponized propaganda. My phone started ringing before noon. Neighbors, friends, even my ex-wife Sarah calling from Denver to ask what the hell was happening. The humiliation tasted like copper pennies and burned coffee, coating my throat with shame I didn't deserve. But Brenda had made a critical mistake. Thursday morning brought a knock from Sheriff Deputy Williams, a soft-spoken man who'd known my family since childhood. He held one of the flyers, his expression somewhere between embarrassment and anger. Marcus, I've got to ask, did you give permission for these court documents to be published? Hell no. Those records are supposed to be sealed. That's what I figured. He folded the flyer carefully, like evidence. Unauthorized publication of sealed court documents is a felony. So is harassment designed to damage reputation. You want to press charges? While Deputy Williams launched his investigation, I discovered something that made Brenda's legal troubles multiply like bacteria in stagnant water. Pat's official report arrived Friday afternoon, stamped and notarized with the authority of 40 years' experience. His conclusion was unambiguous. Lake Willow Dam structurally sound but requires immediate environmental remediation. Recommend temporary drainage within 60 days to remove accumulated toxins and restore ecosystem balance. The environmental angle gave me legal cover that couldn't be challenged. But Pat's investigation had uncovered something even better: federal permit violations that would sink Brenda's empire like a concrete anchor. "Marcus," Pat said over coffee that tasted like victory, "that marina was built without proper wetland impact studies. Federal law requires environmental assessment for any construction affecting water resources. She never filed the paperwork." I remembered reading about this during my research, something called successor liability that Ruby had mentioned. When property changes hands, new owners inherit all federal permit obligations. Previous owners' violations become current owners' legal nightmare. What's that mean in practical terms? She owes repayment of the original 1954 flood control funding plus penalties. Current value with interest, about $850,000. Friday evening, I stood on my property line watching Brenda's latest wine cruise return to the marina. 20 guests tonight, their laughter floating across water that suddenly felt different, not like something I lived beside, but something I controlled absolutely. The irony was perfect. Brenda had destroyed my grandfather's bridge to improve her view, never realizing that view depended entirely on water I owned. She'd weaponized municipal codes and legal intimidation, not knowing I held federal authority that trumped everything she could throw at me. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Weekend fully booked. Fishing tournament Saturday, wedding reception Sunday. Big money weekend for the resort." I smiled, remembering something my grandfather used to say about patience being the hunter's greatest weapon. He'd learned that lesson in Korean mountains, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The perfect moment was about to arrive. Saturday would bring reporters, federal inspectors, and enough witnesses to ensure Brenda's downfall became public spectacle rather than private revenge. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystal clarity that makes secrets impossible to hide. I was reviewing Pat's environmental report for the third time when Ruby called with news that changed everything. "Marcus, you need to get down here, now." Her office smelled like burnt coffee and legal triumph when I arrived 20 minutes later. Spread across her desk were photocopied documents that looked like they'd been rescued from a fire-yellowed, brittle but legible enough to destroy lives. "My paralegal found these in the state archives basement," Ruby said, her voice barely containing excitement. "Filed under Federal Compliance Lake Projects 1950 to 1960, nobody's looked at this box in 40 years. The documents told a story that made my hands shake. The 1954 lake expansion hadn't just used federal flood control money, it was part of a massive Army Corps of Engineers project spanning 3 counties. The funding came with strings attached that would strangle Brenda's operation. "Look at Section 7, Ruby said, pointing to language that read like a legal landmine. "Any commercial development affecting the federally funded water resource must maintain original access provisions. If those provisions are violated, funding must be repaid with compound interest." My engineer brain started calculating. $800,000 in 1954 money, compounded annually for 70 years at federal rates. The number made my coffee taste like liquid gold. How much are we talking about? Conservative estimate, $2.3 million, but here's the beautiful part, it gets better. Ruby pulled out a folder marked "Wetland Permits Required" and spread the contents like playing cards in a winning hand. Federal law required environmental impact studies for any marina construction affecting water resources. The paperwork trail was supposed to be bulletproof, except Brenda had never filed it. She built a $2 million resort on federally protected water without proper permits, Ruby said, grinning like a shark who'd found blood in the water. That's not just a fine, that's criminal negligence. The legal term was successor liability. When Brenda bought the Henderson Ranch and transformed it into Willow Shores Estates, she inherited every federal obligation tied to the land. Previous owners' compliance failures became her legal nightmare, retroactive to the day she signed the deed. But the real bombshell was hidden in subsection 12 of the original agreement. "Emergency Drainage Authority," Ruby read, her finger tracing language that my grandfather had negotiated 70 years ago. If the dam owner determines environmental contamination threatens ecosystem integrity, immediate drainage is authorized for remediation purposes. Ezra had been smarter than anyone realized. He'd built himself a nuclear option disguised as flood control paperwork. She can fight you in court for years, Ruby continued, but she can't fight federal environmental law. Pat's contamination report gives you bulletproof justification for emergency drainage. I thought about Brenda's weekend bookings, the fishing tournament, the wedding reception, $20,000 in resort revenue depending on pristine lake conditions. The timing was almost too perfect. "There's more," Ruby said, producing a manila envelope that smelled like basement dust and legal dynamite. Private investigator found some interesting financial records. Brenda's empire was built on borrowed money. The resort carried $1,800,000 in construction loans, with monthly payments that exceeded off-season revenue. Any business disruption lasting 60 days would trigger bankruptcy provisions. But the environmental violations made her vulnerable to something worse than bankruptcy federal seizure. If the Army Corps determines willful permit violations, Ruby explained, they can seize the property pending compliance. She loses everything, the resort, the marina, even her personal residence if it's tied to the business loans. The irony was so perfect it made my grandfather's ghost smile. Brenda had destroyed his bridge to protect her view, never realizing that view existed entirely at my discretion. She'd weaponized municipal codes and legal intimidation, not knowing I held federal authority that trumped everything she could deploy. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Saturday fishing tournament starting at dawn. Biggest event of the season. Ms. Kelsworth expecting record profits." I looked at Ruby, then at the documents that would end Brenda's reign of terror. "How long do we need to file the drainage notice?" 72 hours minimum for emergency environmental remediation. Then we file Monday morning, let her have one last perfect weekend before the lake disappears. Justice, it turned out, had a sense of timing as precise as Swiss clockwork. Monday morning felt like D-Day minus 72 hours. Ruby's office had transformed into a war room, complete with legal documents spread across every surface and enough coffee to fuel a small army. "First things first," Ruby said, adjusting her reading glasses over a stack of federal forms. "We file the emergency environmental remediation notice. Pat's contamination report gives us bulletproof justification." Pat Kowalski arrived at 9 sharp, carrying a briefcase that clinked with soil sample vials and decades of dam inspection experience. His weathered hands moved with surgical precision as he laid out the technical documentation that would justify draining 47 acres of toxic lake water. "The contamination levels are worse than I initially reported," Pat said, pointing to lab results that read like an environmental horror story. "Heavy metals, petroleum byproducts, chemical runoff from boat maintenance. This water's been slowly poisoning the ecosystem for years." I studied the technical specifications while Pat explained the drainage procedure. The original 1953 design used a manual crank system that required no electricity, just muscle, leverage, and the kind of engineering precision that Korean War veterans understood instinctively. 3-stage process, Pat continued, sketching diagrams on Ruby's whiteboard. Warning valve first, drops the level 6 inches per hour. Gives fish time to concentrate in deeper areas. Then gradual release, another 12 hours to drain the main basin. Finally, full evacuation through the emergency spillway. The entire operation would take 18 to 24 hours, long enough for wildlife rescue, short enough to prevent Brenda from obtaining injunctive relief through her collection of bought and paid for lawyers. Jake Morrison became our inside intelligence asset, though the kid looked like he might vomit from stress every time we discussed the plan. His girlfriend was 7 months pregnant, and losing his marina job would destroy them financially. But his conscience had finally won the war against his wallet. "Weekend bookings are completely sold out," Jake reported, nervously checking his phone for messages from Brenda. "Fishing tournament Saturday, corporate retreat Sunday, wedding reception Sunday evening. She's expecting $30,000 in revenue." Ruby coordinated the legal paperwork with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years outmaneuvering bigger law firms. Federal environmental notices, county drainage permits, liability waivers that would protect us from lawsuits when Brenda's empire collapsed into mud. "The beauty of emergency environmental authority," Ruby explained while notarizing documents, "is that it supersedes almost everything else. Zoning laws, HOA covenants, even preliminary injunctions, none of it matters when federal contamination standards are violated. I remembered her telling me about a case from her law school days where a dairy farmer had successfully drained a polluted pond despite opposition from 3 municipalities and a state environmental agency. The key was proper documentation and unassailable scientific justification. Pat's contamination report provided both. Tuesday brought unexpected reinforcements. Dr. Sarah Olivia from the State Wildlife Department arrived with a truck full of temporary holding tanks and enough volunteers to relocate every fish in the lake. Word had spread through environmental circles about our ecosystem restoration project. "We've been wanting to study Lake Willow's contamination for years," Dr. Olivia said, testing water samples that would make great evidence in federal court. "The resort's boat traffic has accelerated pollution beyond natural recovery capacity. Temporary drainage is exactly what this ecosystem needs." The fish rescue operation would provide perfect cover for media attention. Environmental restoration always played better on camera than property disputes or HOA revenge stories. Wednesday evening, I walked the dam's length with a flashlight, checking mechanisms that my grandfather had maintained until the day he died. The manual crank system was beautifully simple, a testament to 1950s engineering that prioritized function over complexity. WD-40 and 70 years of careful maintenance had kept everything operational. The smell of machine oil and lake water mixed with anticipation as I tested each component. Warning valve, operational. Main release, smooth as silk. Emergency spillway, ready to swallow 47 acres of contaminated water. My phone buzzed with updates from our growing coalition. Ruby had contacted an environmental reporter from the state newspaper story angle focused on heroic lake restoration versus greedy development. Dr. Olivia confirmed fish rescue teams would arrive Friday afternoon. Pat scheduled county emergency services coordination for Saturday morning. Everything was falling into place with the precision of clockwork designed by someone who understood that timing matters more than force. Thursday night, I sat in grandfather's cabin reading his maintenance logs by lamplight. His final entry, dated 3 weeks before his death, made my throat tight. The lake remembers its natural state. Someday, someone will help it find that memory again. Ezra had known this day would come. He'd preserved the drainage authority not just as a legal nuclear option, but as an environmental necessity. The lake needed to breathe, to purge itself of decades of accumulated poison, to remember what clean water felt like. Friday would bring media crews, federal inspectors, and enough witnesses to ensure Brenda's downfall became public spectacle rather than private revenge. Saturday would bring justice flowing like 47 acres of liberated water. Friday morning shattered like glass against concrete when Brenda made her most desperate move yet. I was testing the dam's warning valve one final time when 3 black SUVs pulled into my driveway like some suburban invasion force. Out stepped Brenda, her lawyer son-in-law Dale, and 2 men in tactical gear who looked like they'd stepped out of a military contractor catalog. "Marcus Henley," announced the lead contractor, a granite-faced man whose biceps strained against his polo shirt. "I'm Rick Stevenson, Northwood Security. We're here to prevent terrorist activity against critical infrastructure." Terrorist activity. The woman had actually called me a terrorist for exercising legal rights on my own property. "This dam provides water security for the entire community," Brenda declared, positioning herself between me and the control mechanisms like some suburban general. "Your threatened sabotage constitutes domestic terrorism under the Patriot Act." Dale stepped forward with an emergency injunction thick as a phone book. Federal court order prohibiting interference with community water supply. Violation carries 10 years federal prison. I examined the paperwork while my blood pressure climbed toward dangerous territory. The injunction looked official, impressive letterhead, judicial seal, enough legal language to choke a lawyer. But something smelled wrong, like week old fish wrapped in legal briefs. "This is dated yesterday," I said, pointing to the filing timestamp. "How did you get a federal judge to issue emergency orders in 18 hours? Dale's confident smile flickered like a candle in wind. "Judge Morrison is a family friend." He understood the urgency. Judge Morrison, Jake's uncle. The pieces clicked together like a combination lock opening to reveal corruption inside. That afternoon, while Brenda's mercenaries established a perimeter around my dam, Ruby launched a legal counterattack that would have made Sherman proud. "Marcus, this injunction is fraudulent," she said, waving the document like a surrender flag. "Judge Morrison retired last month. He has no authority to issue federal orders." But Ruby had discovered something even better than fraudulent paperwork. Her investigation into Brenda's financial empire had uncovered a paper trail that led straight to federal prison. "Your friend Brenda has been bribing county officials for years," Ruby continued, spreading bank records across her desk like evidence in a murder trial. "Building permits, environmental waivers, zoning variances, she bought them all, including that fraudulent injunction. The FBI takes federal corruption seriously, especially when it involves infrastructure and environmental law." Ruby's call to the regional office had triggered an investigation that would make Brenda's legal troubles multiply like cancer cells. Meanwhile, Northwood Security was learning that private contractors have no authority on private property. Sheriff Deputy Williams arrived Friday evening with backup and a very clear message. "Ms. Kelsworth, you're trespassing. Your men need to leave immediately or face arrest." "But the federal injunction is worthless paper signed by a retired judge," Deputy Williams interrupted. "Pack up your toy soldiers and get off Mr. Henley's land." "Yeah." The contractors withdrew like smoke, leaving Brenda standing alone in my driveway wearing an expression that could curdle milk. Her empire was crumbling, and she knew it. Saturday morning brought the media circus I'd been expecting. Environmental reporters, local news crews, and enough cameras to film a Hollywood blockbuster. Dr. Olivia's fish rescue operation provided perfect visuals. Volunteers and waiters carefully netting bass and bluegill while explaining ecosystem restoration to fascinated journalists. "This is environmental terrorism," Brenda screamed at anyone with a microphone, her composure finally cracking like cheap paint. "He's destroying our lake to satisfy some personal vendetta." But the reporters had done their homework. Pat's contamination report, federal permit violations, and Brenda's history of municipal corruption painted a very different picture. "Ms. Kelsworth," asked Channel 7's environmental correspondent, "how do you respond to allegations that your resort has been illegally dumping pollutants into federally protected waters?" Brenda's answer involved several words that would require bleeping for broadcast television. By noon, federal investigators had arrived to examine the permit violations that Ruby had uncovered. Agent Patricia Hayes from the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division looked like someone who'd built her career prosecuting environmental criminals. "Mr. Henley," Agent Hayes said after reviewing Pat's contamination data, "your drainage operation is not only legal, it's environmentally necessary. This lake has been poisoned for years." The fishing tournament proceeded as scheduled, though participants kept asking why the water smelled like diesel fuel and tasted like industrial runoff. Brenda's perfect weekend was dissolving like sugar in acid rain. Jake texted updates throughout the day. Resort guests demanding refunds, wedding party threatening lawsuit over contaminated venue, Ms. Kelsworth locked in office screaming at lawyers. Sunday evening, I stood at the dam controls watching Brenda's final wine cruise return to a marina that wouldn't exist much longer. 22 guests sipping champagne above water that would disappear in 18 hours, their laughter echoing across 47 acres of environmental crime scene. The manual crank felt smooth under my palm, 70 years of careful maintenance ready to release decades of accumulated justice. Monday morning would bring the flood not of water, but of consequences. Sunday night brought Brenda's final, desperate gambit, one that would have impressed Machiavelli for its sheer audacity and disgusted him for its complete lack of honor. My phone rang at 11:30 p.m. Sarah's number. My ex-wife calling from Denver at midnight Mountain Time meant either emergency or catastrophe. Given recent events, I assumed the worst. "Marcus," Sarah's voice was tight with anger and something else, fear. "I just had the strangest visit. Some woman claiming to represent a family advocacy organization offered me $50,000 to testify that you're an unfit father." The metallic taste of rage filled my mouth as Sarah described her visitor. Blonde, expensively dressed, driving a white Range Rover with Colorado plates. Brenda had driven 6 hours to Denver to personally orchestrate character assassination. She had copies of our divorce proceedings, custody evaluations, even photos of you at the lake, Sarah continued. Said you were mentally unstable and threatening community safety. Wanted me to file emergency custody modifications to prevent you from dangerous activities. The plan was diabolically simple. Emergency custody hearing Monday morning would require my presence in Denver family court. I'd missed the drainage deadline, giving Brenda time to mobilize legitimate federal intervention. By the time I returned, her lawyers would have every environmental agency in 3 states tied up in injunctive relief. I recorded the whole conversation, Sarah said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. This woman confessed to bribing witnesses in a federal investigation. She's looking at felony conspiracy charges. My ex-wife might have divorced me, but she'd never lost her sense of justice. Despite our problems, Sarah knew I was a good father and decent man. More importantly, she despised bullies who tried to weaponize children in adult conflicts. Send that recording to Ruby Martinez immediately, I said. And Sarah, thank you. Monday arrived with the kind of crystal clarity that makes secrets impossible to hide. I was at the dam by 5 a.m. checking systems one final time while media crews established positions around the lake like war correspondents covering a siege. Ruby arrived with federal paperwork that sparkled like legal armor in the morning sun. EPA approval for emergency environmental remediation, Army Corps of Engineers authorization for dam operation, and enough liability waivers to protect us from every lawsuit Brenda's legal team could conceive. The FBI wants Brenda's bribery recording, Ruby said, adjusting her reading glasses over documents that would end careers. Agent Hayes says it's evidence of federal conspiracy to obstruct environmental investigation. 6 a.m. brought Pat Kowalski and his official county engineer authorization. Dr. Olivia arrived with fish rescue teams and enough scientific justification to satisfy the most aggressive environmental lawyer. Everything was perfectly legal, completely documented, and absolutely devastating to Brenda's empire. The media coverage had already shifted from local property dispute to environmental restoration versus corporate corruption. National news trucks lined the access road like metallic vultures, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like technological prayer wheels. 7 a.m. brought Brenda's final breakdown. She appeared at the dam in her pajamas and a fur coat, hair wild as a scarecrow's, screaming threats that would require extensive bleeping for broadcast television. Behind her trailed Dale and 2 environmental lawyers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. "You can't do this," she shrieked at the assembled media. "This is my lake, my investment, my life's work." "Actually," I said, holding up the original 1951 deed for cameras to see, "this is my grandfather's lake. You've just been borrowing it." Agent Hayes stepped forward with handcuffs that gleamed like jewelry in the morning sun. "Brenda Kelsworth, you're under arrest for conspiracy to bribe federal witnesses, obstruction of environmental investigation, and violation of federal water protection statutes." With the sight of Brenda being stuffed into the back of an FBI sedan while wearing designer pajamas and screaming about property rights would have been comedy gold if it wasn't so pathetic. 8 a.m. brought the moment I'd been waiting for since October. I placed my hand on the manual crank that my grandfather had installed 70 years ago. The metal felt warm under my palm, heated by morning sun and decades of careful maintenance. Around me, cameras clicked like mechanical insects recording history. "This drainage isn't about revenge," I told the assembled reporters, thinking about Pat's contamination data and Dr. Olivia's ecosystem analysis. "It's about restoration. Sometimes you have to empty something completely before you can make it clean again." The warning valve opened with a satisfying clank that echoed across 47 acres of contaminated water. Lake level began dropping immediately, 6 inches per hour, exactly as grandfather Ezra had designed. Behind me, Brenda's resort guests were discovering that their luxury weekend had become an environmental disaster movie. Boats grounded on exposed mudflats, swimming pools cracked as water pressure equalized, and million-dollar investments disappeared into federal evidence bags. Justice, it turned out, flowed exactly like water slow at first, then all at once. The transformation began immediately. By 10 a.m., Lake Willow had dropped 3 feet, exposing decades of environmental crimes that Brenda's pristine surface had hidden like makeup over rotting flesh. The first thing to emerge from the receding waters was a graveyard of boat batteries, dozens of them scattered across the muddy bottom like toxic tombstones. Then came the oil drums, chemical containers, and enough petroleum waste to qualify as a federal Superfund site. "Jesus Christ," muttered Channel 7's environmental correspondent, filming the apocalyptic landscape while trying not to gag on the stench. "This isn't a lake, it's a hazardous waste dump." Agent Hayes and her EPA team swarmed the exposed lake bed like crime scene investigators, taking soil samples and photographing evidence that would send Brenda to federal prison for the rest of her natural life. The contamination was worse than Pat's initial report had indicated. decades of resort operations dumping everything from kitchen grease to boat fuel directly into federally protected waters. Noon brought the best television of my life. Brenda's million-dollar boats sat tilted at crazy angles in the mud like beached whales, their pristine hulls now caked with black sludge that reeked of industrial decay. Resort guests stood on the marina deck holding champagne glasses and staring at 47 acres of environmental crime scene. The wedding party arrived at 1 p.m. for their Lakeside reception, only to discover their venue had become a moonscape. The bride, some pharmaceutical heiress from Phoenix, took one look at the exposed wasteland and started screaming at Dale about lawsuits and ruined dreams. "Ma'am," I called from the dam controls, "I can recommend several lawyers, though you might want to avoid anyone named Kelsworth." By 2 p.m., the media circus had attracted national attention. CNN's environmental team arrived with satellite trucks and enough camera equipment to film a documentary. The story had everything: corporate corruption, environmental destruction, federal crimes, and one man fighting to honor his grandfather's legacy. "Mr. Henley," called the CNN correspondent, a sharp-eyed woman who'd built her career exposing environmental criminals. "Critics say you're destroying the lake out of personal revenge. How do you respond?" I gestured toward the exposed contamination, where EPA agents were photographing evidence of crimes that stretched back decades. "Ma'am, the only thing being destroyed here was hidden under 20 feet of water. We're not draining the lake, we're exposing the crime scene." The mic drop moment hit like lightning. 3 p.m. brought Sheriff Deputy Williams with an arrest warrant for Dale, who'd been found hiding in the resort's wine cellar with a briefcase full of cash and falsified environmental permits. The sight of Brenda's son-in-law being perp-walked past his ruined marina while wedding guests demanded refunds was television gold. 4 p.m. revealed the full scope of Brenda's environmental terrorism. As water levels dropped below the marina foundation, workers discovered an illegal sewage pipe dumping resort waste directly into the lake. The EPA's portable testing equipment went haywire, measuring contamination levels that exceeded federal safety standards by factors that made Agent Hayes reach for her phone to call in additional investigators. "This is the worst environmental crime I've seen in 20 years, Agent Hayes told reporters, holding up soil samples that looked like toxic mud. "The perpetrators will face federal charges including conspiracy, environmental terrorism, and willful endangerment of public water resources." 5 p.m. brought the moment I'd been waiting for since October. Dr. Olivia's fish rescue teams had successfully relocated over 10,000 bass, bluegill, and trout to temporary holding ponds. The healthy fish would return to clean water. The contaminated ones would become evidence in federal court. 6 p.m. brought complete drainage. Lake Willow's bottom lay exposed to sunlight for the first time in 70 years, revealing not just environmental crimes but historical artifacts from the original valley. Native American arrowheads, colonial-era farming tools, and remnants of the original Willow Creek bed that my grandfather had preserved beneath the artificial lake. The sunset over the empty lake bed created a surreal landscape that cameras couldn't adequately capture. 47 acres of exposed earth stretched between mountains like an ancient amphitheater, with Brenda's stranded resort perched above it like some ridiculous monument to greed and stupidity. Local families arrived with metal detectors and fishing nets, their children playing in the original creek bed that grandfather Ezra had protected for 70 years. Elderly residents shared stories about swimming in the natural springs before federal money transformed everything into tourist paradise. "My great-grandfather used to pan for gold in this creek," said Mrs. Patterson, an 80-year-old whose family had lived here since territorial days. "Hasn't seen daylight since Eisenhower was president." As darkness fell, I stood where my grandfather's bridge used to span clean water, watching FBI agents catalog evidence under portable floodlights. The lake would refill naturally from mountain springs and seasonal runoff clean water replacing contaminated waste, exactly as nature intended. Brenda's empire had evaporated like morning mist, leaving only mud and federal charges behind. 30 days later, I stood on my grandfather's rebuilt bridge, listening to the sweetest sound in the world, clean water lapping against natural shoreline. The lake had refilled slowly, fed by mountain springs that sparkled like liquid diamonds in morning sunlight. The smell was different now. Gone was the diesel fuel stench and chemical tang that had haunted the water for decades. In its place, the crisp scent of pine and fresh water that I remembered from childhood visits with Ezra. Brenda's legal troubles had multiplied like rabbits in springtime. Federal conspiracy charges, environmental terrorism, bribery of public officials. The FBI had built a case that would keep her in orange jumpsuits until she qualified for Medicare. Dale faced similar charges, plus document falsification and obstruction of justice. Both were looking at 15 to 20 in federal prison. The resort property sat empty, slowly being reclaimed by nature as federal cleanup crews worked to undo decades of environmental damage. Weeds grew through cracked marble floors where Brenda's wine parties used to celebrate the conquest of natural beauty. My rebuilt bridge opened Thanksgiving weekend with a ceremony that drew 300 people and enough home-cooked food to feed a small army. The aroma of turkey and stuffing mixed with pine needles and lake air as Mayor Patricia Collins unveiled the bronze plaque. Ezra Henley Memorial Crossing, Korean War veteran, conservationist, protector of Lake Willow. The reconstruction had become a labor of love. Local contractors donated weekends, the lumberyard sold materials at cost, and volunteers showed up with coffee and determination until the job was done. Kids who'd never known the original bridge helped paint railings and learned stories about the grandfather they'd never met. My custody situation resolved beautifully when Sarah's recording of Brenda's bribery attempt became federal evidence. Judge Williams not only expanded my visitation rights, but commended Sarah's integrity in court. My kids now spend entire summers at the lake learning to fish in water clean enough to drink. The environmental tourism replacing Brenda's artificial luxury proved both sustainable and profitable. Serious fishermen drove from 3 states to catch bass in unpolluted water. Families discovered camping under stars instead of Italian marble. Local businesses thrived selling authentic mountain crafts instead of imported resort trinkets. I established the Ezra Henley Conservation Scholarship using proceeds from speaking engagements about water rights and environmental justice. The first recipient was Jake Morrison's younger brother Tommy, who wanted to design pollution prevention systems instead of just cleaning up messes. Jake himself now apprentices under Pat Kowalski, learning dam engineering from someone who understands that infrastructure serves communities, not corporations. The annual Bridge Festival each September draws thousands of visitors celebrating community over commercialization. Local bands play on a stage built from reclaimed resort lumber. Children jump off the bridge exactly as their parents and grandparents had done, continuing traditions that Brenda couldn't destroy with all her money and lawyers. Lake Willow became a model for environmental restoration nationwide. Engineering students study our drainage procedures. Federal agencies cite our project as proof that private citizens can successfully fight corporate pollution when armed with legal knowledge and community support. Ruby Martinez's practice now handles water rights cases across 4 states. Her success with federal environmental law attracts clients fighting similar battles against developers who prioritize profits over preservation. She's never lost another water rights case, though she jokes that nothing will ever top draining an entire lake for justice. The ecosystem recovery exceeded every scientific prediction. Fish populations tripled within 18 months. Dr. Olivia's research documented how temporary drainage could restore damaged artificial lakes, providing blueprints for similar projects worldwide. 6 months after the drainage, state environmental officials designated Lake Willow as protected watershed under federal conservation programs. Permanent protection from commercial development, guaranteed public access, and funding for ongoing monitoring. Ezra's vision finally had legal teeth sharp enough to bite developers who threatened his sanctuary. Standing on the rebuilt bridge this evening, watching sunset paint clean water the color of burnished copper, I can almost hear grandfather's approving chuckle echoing across water that will remain pristine long after I'm gone. Some battles are worth fighting not for personal victory, but for principles that outlast individual lives. Clean water, community respect, keeping promises to future generations. If you've survived your own HOA nightmare, share your story in the comments. The HOA Stories community reads every single one, and your experience might help someone else fight back. And if this story restored your faith that ordinary people can still defeat corrupt systems when truth and persistence team up, smash that subscribe button and join the HOA Stories family. We're just getting started.
Thank you for tuning in to HOA Stories, where neighbors stand up against HOA Karens and karma comes a-knocking. If you like this story, hit that like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more HOA tales and real-life neighborhood drama each week.